Most people are aware that J.r.r. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and not only that, but also a lover of history and a medievalist. With such a background, it's reasonable to wonder what his thoughts were on a number of issues, and what historical event is more associated with both Catholicism and medievalism than the Crusades. And yet, to the surprise of most perhaps, there are actually very few sources on Tolkien's views regarding the Crusades. Very few, but not zero. Nonetheless, according to my research, there is not a single mention of the Crusades in any of his published letters, nor did he ever really work on anything associated with them. His main field as a lover of medieval history primarily concerned the dealings of the Anglo-Saxons, the Norse, the German, and the French. And while most of them had a role to play in the Crusades too, Tolkien's focus never really intertwined with that part of the respective histories of those cultures. However, there is a notable exception. When one thinks of England and the Crusades, there is usually one figure that immediately comes to mind: Richard the Lionheart. Richard I was an Angevin king of England who reigned during a time when the English monarch also held under his control large parts of France, and primarily the powerful duchies of Aquitaine and Normandy. To make a very long story short, Richard lived most of his life abroad and was immortalized in history for his campaigns during the Third Crusade. The accounts of his deeds in battle paint a picture of, simply put, a force of nature, and his reputation as a great warrior king grew and persisted even following his death. I won't get into the details of Richard's life, but what you must know is that he is perceived as a giant in England's royal history, and especially of the medieval period. His participation in the Third Crusade and his other deeds truly cemented his role in history as the Lionheart, one of the very few English kings to be remembered for their epithet. Now, whether this perception that grew in the popular imagination was accurate doesn't matter. What does matter is that the 1912 Newdigate Prize for the English Verse, offered at the University of Oxford, was themed Richard I before Jerusalem. Therefore, entries made by students had to deal with the legendary English king and submitted for a chance at winning. A manuscript written by Tolkien, usually known as A Fragment of an Epic Before Jerusalem, was signed and dated to July 1911. This can be explained by Tolkien either learning of the 1912 prize's theme beforehand, as he joined Oxford in October of 1911, or that he had already worked on a Richard poem independently, which seems a lot more unlikely. Interestingly, another title given to the work was this Old English, which translates to Richard, King of England, speaks before the army, even though the poem has no such speech, perhaps indicating that what we're reading truly is a fragment of something larger that has been lost to time, a common theme of Tolkien's writings. Now keep in mind that everything will be presented to you as is, and nothing will be censored. This is a historical text to be studied, and with that, let us get into it. The poem begins at what seems to be the aftermath of a speech, and we are shown an image of great knights in shining armor ready to fight for the cross. The noblest, most kingly of all who wore the sign of the cross was none other than King Richard, by whose side hangs a legendary sword, described as being able to fight the enemies of Christ and hordes of hell. A battle begins, and Tolkien describes in detail the grace of the Christian host, in contrast to what he calls the horde of the foes of Christ and of Christendom, who stood against the one known as the Lion-Hearted. The warriors of Christ die one by one, and yet their enemies seem never-ending, wave after wave of unrelenting slaughter. Undaunted by that outpour from the silent sluice of dread, following their gold-clad leader, all the squadron clothed in awe, loud calling on the cross as fell tearing lightning sped, with the clanging wrathful thunder of God angered, and like straw were the thronging tribes unnumbered cleft as cleft will be the damned, on the latest day of dooming by the angels of God's ire in flashing holy onslaught. Yet ever a mightier band still living strove demented with their brandished blades afire, in rank on rank to sully neath their foul-hewn pagan blows the Red Cross warriors' armor glinting fair, to smite and hew with ill-curved blades of cunning the holy badge which rose ever before the loathing of their maddened blood-fain view. And many a knight met bane thus beneath those strokes of dread, endued with the living purple of his warrior's martyrdom, the war-torn purple token of his master's death, who shed his blood in that same holy, often violated home. Such a passage describes most of the poem. Tolkien uses a lot of Christian imagery and feelings, such as references to the crucifixion of Christ himself in reference to the martyrdom of the Christian warriors, while simultaneously describing a very violent affair. The way that the poem is framed, there is a definitive line between the Crusaders and those described as pagans, with the former fighting for heaven and the latter for hell. In fact, a great enemy warrior that is felled by Richard is referred to outright as a vassal lord of hell. Later on, Tolkien even makes a direct reference to Islam by mentioning Muhammad directly. Now torn as by ravening whirlpools round the ocean's teeth, in that fell rush of horror, but few cross-clad knights there clave an eye to lion-hearted Richard. Yet awhile they smote and drave and reaped for the burning the foul fruit of Mahmud's lie, till on the sick earth bestrode in loathly piles there lay, all weltering the defty wrought gear of Araby. Still ever flashed and fell that grim arm more listlessly, while thicker ever swarmed the bandsmen to the fray, and thinner grew the circle of the leaping swords which rose and hewed but now about him. Down scorched the awful sun, and the main host of the steel-lapped avengers of Christendom were sundered, wrapped in battle by a sea of hungry foes. His heart waxed dark and sullen, and all the battle lust forsook his soul, for round him his gallant liegemen died mid the howls of Mahmud's werewolves, and stained was the bloody dust. As you can see, 19-year-old Tolkien was very clear about the type of text he was writing, and he certainly wasn't pulling any punches. Now, what we must keep in mind for the sake of historical accuracy is that we have no idea what his mindset was when writing his work, nor its context. Naturally, there was no such thing as political correctness in 1911, especially towards other religions, and the man was a devout Catholic from a young age, so the things he presented could very well be the things he felt about Islam and the Crusades when he was from the ages of 19 to at least 22, as we know that he had made some edits to the poem in 1914. As we don't have many sources regarding his views on the Crusades from later in life, or on Islam for that matter, we can't really say whether his stance ever changed. Considering he remained a devout Catholic throughout his life, I am inclined to say no. However, for the sake of historical objectivity, I don't think I can give you a clear answer. I am sure if you read The Lord of the Rings and its presentation of certain Eastern-inspired factions, you will come to your own conclusions. However, even in that work, it is clear that he humanized them and did not present them as a tool of hell, like in the poem. This passage from The Lord of the Rings comes to mind. It was Sam's view of a battle of men against men, and he did not like it much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was, and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. As I said, these things are up to your own interpretations. Regardless, the poem ends after 198 lines, with much room to spare where the 300-line limit of the Oxford Prize was concerned. The ending describes the final moments of the battle, where the last remaining of the king's knights surround a severely wounded Richard and take him away. The king had been injured fighting a dark warrior, and is only able to defeat him by calling upon God. In the end, the king is presented as a symbol of a persisting light standing against the darkness of hell. Felt with the frozen scorning still graven on his face, the marshaller of all the vast vassal hordes fell dead, and men seemed a mighty moaning rose and ever waxed apace of awful hate and terror, and the lamp of heaven fled, and it was as if a nighttime of heavy speechless spell sank down, and the air grew loaded and thick, as with some dim wrong in its last mad throes defeated and cast back to lightless hell. But now the light returned, and still stood a battered throng around their wounded king. But men feared and wondered sore, for there were the glistening fragments of the shivered bloom of strife, and there the gruesome staining of an evil pool of gore, where the champion of evil had split his bitter life. But the body had been wafted by that awful fleeting night. Behold, the ravening wolf throngs fled like leaves white scattering before the vengeful wind of the enheartened Christian might, and with awe and joy and sorrow they stooped and raised their king. The poem is a bit of a hidden gem in my opinion. Not only does it give you a very unique insight into Tolkien and his interests as a teenager, but you can also get hints of his future writings, especially when it comes to battles and the presentation of good versus evil. In the end, Tolkien did not win the prize, as this honor went to future academic William Chase Green, and unfortunately not much else is known about the events of that period, at least where this work is concerned. Ultimately, in case you ever wondered what J.r.r. Tolkien thought of the Crusades, I hope I've provided you with at least some valuable information to consider. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.